Today, when we think of cavemen, we imagine rough hunters chasing mammoths, simple tools, and small fires flickering in caves. But 13,000 years ago, along the banks of the Nile, something happened that changes that picture completely. Scientists found a battlefield, a real one, littered with the bones of men, women, and children who were killed with deadly precision. Arrows, spears, ambush formations, even signs of captives. This wasn't chaos. It was strategy. It was war. Long before kings or armies or written history, humans were already planning massacres. The attackers knew where to strike, when to move, and how to trap their enemies. They weren't mindless hunters. They were tacticians. The bones tell us how they thought, how they planned, and how far they were willing to go to survive. And that's the terrifying part. Because what happened on that ancient riverbank isn't just a story about the past. It's a story about us. If you use these to fall asleep, that's literally why I make them. So, subscribe maybe and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing it. Tokyo at sunrise, Chicago past midnight, all listening to echoes of a war fought 13,000 years ago. You know that feeling when you stumble across something that changes everything you thought you knew? Like when you dig into the ground expecting to find old rocks and end up staring into a graveyard older than history itself. That is what happened in the middle of a dusty riverbank in northern Africa. A team of scientists thought they were uncovering the remains of an ancient settlement, maybe signs of early fishing or simple village life. What they found instead looked more like a battlefield. Skeletons tangled together, arrows still buried in bone, skulls smashed in, ribs pierced. It was chaos frozen in time. At first it didn't make sense. 13,000 years ago was supposed to be long before war. Textbooks painted those people as nomads wandering the wild, small bands hunting animals, not each other. But as archaeologists brushed away sand and catalogued wounds, one truth became impossible to ignore. Someone had planned this. Someone had organized an ambush, used real tactics, and wiped out an entire group. These weren't random killings. They were part of something older and darker, a human story that began long before kings or empires. The site sat near the Nile, in a region that would later cradle some of the world's first civilizations. Back then, it was a place of survival. The planet was just emerging from the Ice Age, and Africa's climate was shifting between flood and drought. The Nile's edge was everything. Water, food, and safety all depended on it. And that meant whoever controlled it lived. Whoever lost it died. For generations, small groups shared these resources, until one day, someone decided sharing was no longer an option. The bones told the story. Arrows came from different directions. Victims had been hit multiple times. Some showed defensive wounds on their arms, as if they tried to shield themselves from blows. Others had injuries to the back of their skulls, suggesting they were struck while fleeing or already down. There was no pattern of ritual burial, no signs of respect. The bodies were left as they fell, scattered across a patch of ground that once soaked up their blood. What shocked scientists even more was the planning behind it. Whoever carried out this attack had scouted the terrain, predicted where their enemies would be, and struck when the victims were most vulnerable. This wasn't a spontaneous fight over food or territory. It was coordinated, deliberate, and brutal. In other words, it was war. For decades, people believed organized conflict came with civilization, that it took farming, cities, and power structures to make humans capable of mass killing. But this discovery shattered that illusion. It proved something chilling. Violence, strategy, and collective aggression weren't inventions of kings. They were instincts that came with us from the beginning. Those bones in the sand are more than fossils. They are the fingerprints of our oldest war. They whisper that even in the age of stone and fire, when survival was everything, humans could already look at another group and see not neighbors, but enemies. And that realization might be the most haunting part of all. It started with the wind. Every season it blew across the Nile Valley, carving away at the soft riverbank, stripping layers of sand and silt that had built up over thousands of years. Locals had always known the land hid secrets: pottery shards, stone tools, the occasional animal bone. But one afternoon, something strange appeared in the cliff face. A pale curve of bone, too thick for an animal, too smooth to be stone. When the archaeologists arrived, they expected to find a single burial, maybe an early fisher or hunter laid to rest beside the river that gave them life. What they found was a nightmare from 13,000 years ago. As they dug deeper, more bones surfaced. First one skull, then another, then a third, still half, buried in compacted sediment. Within days, the team realized they weren't uncovering a graveyard. They were uncovering a massacre. The skeletons were tangled, overlapping, scattered across a patch of ground only a few meters wide. Many of them still had stone points embedded in ribs and spines. One woman's skull held a projectile lodged so deep it never came out. A child's tiny bones lay beside an adult's, both struck down together. It was chaos captured in perfect detail. The site became known as Jebel Sahaba, a quiet place on the east bank of the Nile near the border of modern Sudan and Egypt. To an untrained eye, it looks ordinary, a dusty bluff overlooking a slow bend of the river. But beneath the surface, it holds one of the oldest pieces of evidence for organized human violence ever found. The bones had been sealed in sediment for thousands of years, preserved by the Nile's flooding cycles. Each layer of silt recording another moment in deep time. When the river began to erode that bank, it exposed what no one was supposed to see. As excavations continued, the horror deepened. Nearly 60 individuals were uncovered. Men, women, children. Almost all showed signs of violent death. Arrow wounds, fractures, smashed skulls. Some had multiple hits from different angles, suggesting they were struck by volleys rather than single shots. These weren't isolated murders or accidents. This was coordinated attack. The victims fell together, their killers vanishing into the sands of time but leaving their weapons behind. Under the microscopes, the details came to life. The stone points were finely crafted, their edges serrated for maximum damage. Many were made from flint, brought from miles away, meaning the attackers prepared long before the strike. They had stocked weapons, travelled, and planned their assault with deadly precision. Scientists even found fragments of arrows that matched each other, proof that multiple projectiles came from the same set of weapons, fired in unison. What makes Jebel Sahaba so haunting is how ordinary the moment must have been before it turned to death. People gathered by the river to fish, to rest, to drink, to live. Then, in a matter of minutes, everything changed. The sand that buried them became their tomb, and the wind that uncovered them 13,000 years later became the voice that told their story. Those bones in the sand still whisper it every time the desert breeze moves across the Nile. The archaeologists arrived with notebooks and brushes, not realizing they were walking into a battlefield. The sun burned high over the Nile Valley, turning the sand into a mirror of light. They marked out careful grids with string, each square a window into the past. At first the work felt routine, another prehistoric site along the river. But as the team brushed away sediment, the story began to twist into something darker. Every trowel scrape revealed more bones, more wounds, more chaos. It wasn't a peaceful burial site. It was the frozen aftermath of violence. They started documenting everything: Every skeleton was photographed, measured, mapped. The positions were strange. Some bodies lay sprawled as if they had fallen mid-run. Others were twisted together, limbs crossing like they were clinging to each other. A few skeletons showed signs of being partially buried before the next flood covered the rest. Archaeologists could almost feel the moment of panic that must have swept through this ancient camp. One person struck down, then another, then an entire community collapsing in the sand. The more they uncovered, the more it looked like a planned massacre rather than a single attack. The tools they used were delicate. Dental picks, soft brushes, small shovels. Each movement was slow and deliberate. They weren't just digging bones. They were unearthing a scene that had remained untouched for 13,000 years. Sometimes they would stop to take a breath, realizing the object in front of them wasn't a rock but a flint point embedded in a rib. It was eerie, like walking through time and watching the last moments of strangers who had no idea their deaths would one day be studied under microscopes. Every discovery added another piece to the puzzle. The bones of a man with deep gashes on his forearm, likely raised to block a blow, a woman with a crushed skull, her hand still near a child's skeleton, the fragments of a spear point lodged between vertebrae. These details began to form a pattern that no one could ignore. This was an organized strike. The killers attacked from multiple directions, cornering the group near the water's edge, where escape was impossible. The archaeologists could see it like a movie, playing in slow motion. They reconstructed everything using detailed maps and computer models. Each skeleton was plotted in 3 dimensions. The entry and exit points of weapons were measured. Even the direction of the attacks could be inferred from bone fractures. What emerged was a story of ambush and precision. The attackers knew where to strike and when. The victims were caught off guard, unable to defend themselves. It was a moment of human cruelty, preserved in sand and silence. When the excavation ended, the site looked like a mosaic of grief. Dozens of skeletons laid bare under the desert sky, each one a chapter in a story written in bone. The archaeologists packed their tools in silence. They came to uncover history but left realizing they had uncovered humanity's oldest war. The bones were ancient, but how ancient exactly was the mystery? The archaeologists knew they had found something extraordinary, but without a date, the story was incomplete. They needed to know when this battle had taken place. The first clues came from the layers of soil themselves. Each band of sediment held the history of a different world, a slice of time captured by floods of the Nile. By studying the order of those layers, scientists could tell that the massacre happened when the river ran narrower and colder than it does today. That meant the end of the Ice Age, a time of massive change across the planet. But they needed proof, not just guesswork. Tiny fragments of charcoal buried among the bones gave them their first chance. Charcoal means fire, and fire means carbon. Radiocarbon dating became the key to unlocking the timeline. When organic material burns, it traps a record of the atmosphere in that moment. Over thousands of years, the radioactive carbon inside it decays at a predictable rate. By measuring what was left, scientists could read time itself. The numbers pointed to a date around 13,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries. That placed the massacre right at the edge of an era called the Late Pleistocene, just before the world plunged into one last cold snap known as the Younger Dryas. This timing was crucial. The Younger Dryas was a global shock, a sudden return to Ice Age conditions after the Earth had started to warm. Rain patterns shifted, grasslands turned to desert, animals migrated or died out. For the people living along the Nile, it meant food became scarce and competition for water grew fierce. The Jebel Sahaba group had been living at the crossroads of survival. The evidence suggested that this was when the killings happened, not by coincidence, but by desperation. Climate change had turned neighbors into rivals and rivals into enemies. To confirm their findings, the team compared the stone tools found at the site with other known examples. The flint points, blades, and scrapers matched tool styles from late Pleistocene hunter-gatherers in northeastern Africa. The craftsmanship was familiar, belonging to groups that lived right before the dawn of agriculture. These weren't primitive weapons. They were engineered, shaped with precision to cut, pierce, and kill. Every match in tool design helped narrow the window of time even further. The final piece of evidence came from the bones themselves. Chemical tests on the remains showed traces of the ancient environment locked inside. The isotopes matched the climate of the Nile Valley at the end of the Ice Age. Together, all the data told a clear story. Around 13,000 years ago, during one of the harshest climate shifts in human history, a community along the Nile was wiped out in an act of calculated violence. Dating the dead turned the discovery from tragedy into history. It proved that what happened at Jebel Sahaba wasn't a myth or isolated act. It was part of humanity's real timeline, a moment when survival collided with cruelty. And in the grand story of our species, it marked the first known page of war. At first glance, it looked like a chaotic scene, a jumble of bones scattered across the ancient riverbank, as if a group had been caught in a sudden storm of violence. But as the archaeologists mapped every position, something began to stand out. The bodies were not random. They formed patterns, arcs, and clusters that told a very different story. This wasn't a brawl or a desperate struggle. It was a trap. The site at Jebel Sahaba wasn't a battlefield. It was a kill zone. The scientists noticed that most of the skeletons faced the same direction, as if they were all moving toward or away from something when they were struck. The wounds lined up too. Stone points were found lodged in ribs, skulls, and spines at nearly identical angles. It was as if arrows had come raining down from a single direction, slicing through the air in coordinated volleys. Victims weren't fighting back. They were running, shielding, or falling. Some had multiple hits, 3, 4, even 5 projectiles embedded in their bones. That wasn't random chance. That was precision. Archaeologists reconstructed the scene using 3-dimensional mapping. When they connected the trajectories of the wounds, they all pointed toward a single, elevated spot along the riverbank. Whoever launched the attack had chosen their ground carefully. From that position, they could fire into the valley below, where their enemies had nowhere to hide. It was a textbook ambush, the kind of strategy you might expect from trained soldiers thousands of years later. Not from hunter-gatherers living 13 millennia ago, yet the evidence was undeniable. The pattern of the fallen suggested the group had been cornered. Some were struck in the back, others from the side. A few had tried to shield children, judging by the smaller skeletons found beneath adult arms. The victims collapsed in arcs, as though the attackers advanced in stages, driving them toward the water. It was efficient, methodical, and horrifying. No one was spared. Men, women, even the elderly bore the same sharp wounds. The archaeologists could almost hear the whistling of flint tips cutting through the air. The ground itself confirmed the story. Around the skeletons were concentrations of broken projectiles and fragments of stone points, the kind of debris left behind when dozens of arrows or spears were launched at once. The density of these fragments was highest in a tight band, a footprint of focused attack. This was not 2 groups clashing hand to hand. It was one group annihilating another from a position of control. The killers had planned every detail, from where to stand to when to strike. When scientists finished reconstructing the scene, the image that emerged was clear and chilling. The Jebel Sahaba massacre was not born from chaos. It was a planned operation. The attackers understood terrain, timing, and teamwork. They turned a simple river crossing into a death trap. For a moment, the myth of the peaceful prehistoric world crumbled. The people who lived 13,000 years ago were not just hunters of animals, they were hunters of each other. And this patch of desert, once filled with life, had become humanity's first organized killing ground. Under a microscope, the weapons that ended dozens of lives at Jebel Sahaba come alive again. To the naked eye, they looked like tiny shards of flint, no bigger than a thumbnail, but under magnification they reveal craftsmanship far beyond what anyone expected from 13,000 years ago. Each stone tip carries the scars of impact. Microscopic fractures spider out from the point of contact, the telltale sign of high-velocity strikes. These were not random flakes chipped off a rock. They were precision tools designed to kill efficiently from a distance. Archaeologists began analyzing the points one by one, cataloguing every detail. Some had been broken clean through ribs, leaving fragments still embedded in the bones. Others showed a thin sheen along their base known as hafting polish, proof they had been attached to wooden shafts using plant resin and animal sinew. The polish pattern was identical on many of the points, meaning they were built with the same technique, maybe even by the same group of weapon makers. Whoever crafted them wasn't experimenting. They were perfecting a design. Microscopic residue analysis revealed tiny traces of blood and bone protein still clinging to the flint after 13,000 years. Each trace was a frozen moment of impact. When scientists compared them, they noticed that the projectiles had different shapes depending on their purpose. Some were wide and flat for cutting, others were long and needle-like for piercing deep into flesh. This wasn't just hunting technology reused in a fight. It was a weapon system, varied and specialized, built for war. The more they studied, the more the researchers realized how advanced these early fighters were. The tips were often heat-treated, meaning the stone had been exposed to fire to make it easier to shape and sharpen. That technique allowed for cleaner breaks and harder edges, producing weapons that could fly straighter and strike deeper. The makers understood physics on an intuitive level. They knew that a lighter shaft and a balanced head would travel farther and hit with more force. Some of the recovered points even showed consistent symmetry, suggesting careful planning rather than random flaking. One of the most haunting discoveries was how many projectiles had shattered on impact. The fractures showed that they hit with enormous energy, strong enough to embed shards into bone and splinter the weapons themselves. The attackers must have carried dozens of these projectiles, firing volley after volley until their targets were down. The concentration of flint fragments across the site painted a picture of precision rather than chaos. This was not wild shooting. It was coordinated, practiced, and effective. When scientists held those ancient weapons in their hands, they weren't just touching tools, they were touching evidence of intent. Every chipped edge, every fracture, every flake of polish spoke of preparation, patience, and purpose. These weren't hunters defending themselves. They were trained killers with weapons built for maximum damage. The people of Jebel Sahaba weren't just victims of violence. They were the first known casualties of organized weapon design, proof that even at the dawn of humanity, someone had already mastered the science of war. When scientists began examining the skeletons from Jebel Sahaba in detail, the pattern of wounds looked almost mathematical. Every injury had direction, every fracture a story of movement, impact, and intention. This was not the random brutality of panic, it was geometry. The entry and exit paths of projectiles lined up with remarkable consistency. Many victims were struck from the same angle, the same height, the same side. When all the data was plotted, a chilling picture appeared. The attackers hadn't just rushed their enemies. They had arranged themselves strategically, using range, timing, and precision to create a deadly crossfire. Each skeleton became a map of the battle. A man with 2 flint points in his ribs and 1 in his spine had been shot while turning to run. The trajectory of the wounds suggested arrows coming from both front and side, meaning at least 2 attackers had him in their sights. A woman's skull showed an entrance wound on the left temple and an exit on the right jaw, a perfect diagonal that matched the slope of the ground behind her. She had likely been crouching when the shot was fired from above. Another individual bore 5 separate punctures, all from slightly different angles. These weren't stray shots, they were coordinated volleys. When the trajectories were overlaid onto a digital reconstruction of the site, the geometry became unmistakable. The victims formed a loose semicircle along the old river edge. The projectiles came from higher ground to the north and west, converging at almost perfect intervals. It was a kill box. The attackers had forced their targets into an open patch of sand between the river and a ridge, leaving no way to retreat. Once trapped, the victims were hit from both sides. The pattern of impacts even revealed moments of pursuit. Some wounds came from above waist height, others from near ground level, suggesting archers advancing as their prey fell. What made the analysis even more haunting was the evidence of close-range strikes. Several skeletons had secondary fractures caused by blunt force trauma. A cracked skull here, a shattered arm there. These were not caused by projectiles, but by clubs or spears used at the end of the assault to finish off survivors. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. It showed a sequence, a rhythm of violence that followed tactical logic. First the volleys to bring down as many as possible, then the sweep to eliminate what was left. The scientists who studied the remains could hardly believe it. This kind of organized precision was something expected in Bronze Age warfare, not in a world of hunter-gatherers 13,000 years ago. Yet the bones told the truth. The geometry of the wounds proved that these early humans understood distance, cover, and the advantage of coordinated timing. The battle at Jebel Sahaba wasn't a chaotic clash of desperate people. It was an orchestrated strike carried out with method and purpose. In every angle of every wound lay evidence of a plan that turned survival into slaughter and strategy into death. When the archaeologists began examining the smaller bones from Jebel Sahaba, they noticed something heartbreaking. Many of the skeletons were twisted in unnatural positions, arms bent over faces, hands raised toward the sky. At first, these contorted postures seemed like the random way bodies might fall. But then they started noticing a pattern. The bones of forearms were broken across the middle. The edges splintered where stone blades had struck. The scientists realized these weren't ordinary injuries. They were defensive wounds. People had raised their arms to block blows, to protect their heads, or maybe to shield someone behind them. These bones were the oldest known evidence of people using their own bodies as shields. Some of the most haunting remains belonged to women and children. In several cases, smaller skeletons were found tucked against larger ones, their limbs overlapping in ways that could only mean one thing. The adults had thrown themselves over the children as the attack began. One woman's arm bones were shattered along their length, and under her torso lay the remains of a child no older than 5. The positioning was too deliberate to be coincidence. She had been shielding the child when the final volley struck. These moments were frozen in time, acts of love and terror preserved in sand for 13,000 years. The archaeologists documented every fracture, every angle, trying to piece together the last desperate seconds of these people's lives. Many skulls bore parry fractures, the kind of injuries that occur when someone lifts an arm to deflect a blow. Others had deep notches in the pelvis or shoulder, signs that attackers had struck downward as victims fell. In one case, 2 skeletons were found side by side, their arms intertwined. The smaller one had been struck in the back, the larger one in the skull. They had likely died trying to escape together. Even in death, they remained locked in the same gesture of protection. Forensic specialists studying the site noticed how consistent the wounds were. The cuts were sharp, clean, and often repeated in the same places. It meant the attackers were not fighting individuals one-on-one. They were shooting into a crowd of people trying to protect themselves and their families. The victims weren't soldiers. They were ordinary members of a community. Some carried evidence of healed wounds from earlier encounters, suggesting they had lived through smaller attacks before. This time, they didn't. What makes these bones so powerful is that they turn abstract violence into human stories. The raised arms, the shattered bones, the intertwined skeletons remind us that even at the dawn of humanity, people loved and tried to protect one another. They felt fear and courage the same way we do. They didn't just die, they fought to save their children, their partners, their friends. 13,000 years later, those raised arms still speak. They tell us that compassion and brutality were born together, that even in the first known massacre in human history, the instinct to protect each other was as strong as the instinct to kill. When scientists finished counting the remains at Jebel Sahaba, they noticed something that changed the entire meaning of the discovery. The victims weren't all men. In fact, the group represented nearly every stage of life. There were adult men and women, teenagers, young children, even infants. Some skeletons were small enough to fit inside the rib cage of an adult. This was not a clash between rival hunting parties or a battle over territory fought only by warriors. It was a slaughter that targeted everyone. The diversity of the victims revealed that the attack was not about honor or ritual. It was about extermination. Archaeologists carefully examined the bones for signs of age and sex. The pattern was consistent. The men showed multiple weapon wounds, often to the chest and back, as if they had been shot while trying to fight or flee. The women bore similar injuries, many to the skull or pelvis, places that suggest they were struck while shielding children or trying to escape. Several children had wounds almost identical to those of the adults, smaller arrows lodged in their ribs or spines. The violence had made no distinction between strong and weak, young or old. Whoever planned this massacre had one goal: to wipe out the entire group. The discovery shattered a long, held idea about early humans. For decades, people imagined prehistoric life as simple and peaceful, with violence limited to occasional hunting disputes. But Jebel Sahaba painted a different picture. It showed that 13,000 years ago, humans were already capable of organized group violence aimed at total destruction. This wasn't the work of a few hot-headed hunters. It required coordination, preparation, and intent. The attackers must have known their victims well. They knew where they lived, when they would be near the river, and how to strike when they were most vulnerable. The fact that women and children were caught in the crossfire proved that the attack wasn't a spontaneous fight. It was a planned massacre. Forensic analysis revealed more clues. Some of the children's bones had healed injuries from earlier encounters, meaning they had survived previous raids. That meant these communities had been living under threat for generations. Violence wasn't random. It was a recurring part of their world. The attackers had likely targeted this group repeatedly, trying to drive them away from vital resources along the Nile. This final assault was simply the last chapter in a long struggle for survival. When researchers pieced together the story, the emotional weight hit hard. These weren't nameless victims from some forgotten era. They were families. They were people who cooked together, hunted together, told stories around firelight, and then were destroyed in a single calculated act of violence. Their remains don't just show that war existed, they show that war once had no rules. In the sand of Jebel Sahaba, we see the first evidence of a truth that still echoes today. That when humans fight, it's rarely just the fighters who die. It's the families, the children, and the innocent who always pay the price. As the excavation at Jebel Sahaba continued, the archaeologists began noticing strange details in some of the skeletons. A few bodies weren't sprawled like those who fell mid-run. Instead, they were positioned in ways that suggested something different. The arms were bent tightly behind the back. The wrists and ankles showed small but consistent marks on the bone surfaces, grooves that could only form under long, unnatural tension. Some of the bones in the shoulders were slightly dislocated, the kind of injury that happens when someone struggles against restraint. These weren't the marks of battle, they were the marks of captivity. One skeleton in particular caught their attention. The man's hands were drawn behind him, the bones twisted and locked as if bound together. His ribs were crushed on one side, suggesting he had fallen or been struck after being tied up. Nearby, another skeleton lay on its side, the knees pulled close to the chest, the ankles crossed unnaturally. The pattern repeated across several graves. These were people who hadn't died fighting or running. They had been restrained, likely captured before being killed. It was the first physical evidence of organized execution in human history. To confirm their theory, the scientists compared these skeletons to modern forensic data. The stress patterns matched those of individuals who had been tied with rope or plant fiber for long periods. In some cases, there were even slight cuts on the bone edges near the wrists and ankles, as if the bindings had bitten into the flesh. It was impossible not to imagine what these people must have endured. Captured, held against their will, and finally killed along with the rest of their group. 13,000 years ago, someone had already learned not just how to fight, but how to dominate and humiliate their enemies. The arrangement of the bodies told an even darker story. Some captives had been placed deliberately among the other dead, while others were found slightly apart, suggesting they had been executed after the initial attack. The lack of defensive wounds on several skeletons reinforced the idea that they hadn't been able to fight back. Their killers had taken time to control the survivors, to bind them, and to end their lives one by one. What once might have been a victory over rivals had turned into ritualized cruelty. The implications were enormous. This wasn't the impulsive chaos of a raid gone too far. It was premeditated. It showed that humans at the end of the Ice Age already understood power as something more than brute force. They had discovered psychological warfare, the ability to break their enemies' spirits before killing them. The victims of Jebel Sahaba were not only the first known casualties of war, but also the first recorded prisoners of war. Their suffering revealed the birth of something deeply human and deeply terrifying. The realization that violence wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about control. When the scientists began studying the bones more closely, they noticed something strange. Not every wound belonged to the same attack. Some of the skeletons showed signs of healing, bone tissue that had begun to regrow around fractures and cuts. That meant the people of Jebel Sahaba had been injured before and lived long enough to recover. These weren't isolated victims of a single event. They were survivors of earlier raids, people who had already seen violence, healed from it, and then faced it again. The massacre wasn't a sudden tragedy, it was the final act in a repeating cycle of conflict. The healed wounds told a haunting story of endurance. One man had an old arrow wound in his left shoulder, the bone reshaped and rough where it had repaired itself. Another skeleton showed a healed fracture across the forearm, the classic mark of a defensive injury. The bone had fused unevenly, suggesting the person had carried that injury for years. In some skulls, small scars of healed cuts traced lines from earlier blows. These were people who had lived in a world where violence was expected. When the final attack came, they recognized it too late. The unhealed wounds were even more telling. Fresh fractures, broken ribs, and shattered skulls that showed no signs of repair meant the injuries were fatal. Comparing the healed and unhealed wounds across the site, scientists began to realize that these people had been attacked multiple times across their lives. It was not a single burst of violence, but a pattern that stretched across generations. Archaeologists could almost feel the rhythm of it. Raids, survival, recovery, and then another attack. The Jebel Sahaba people lived on a fault line of survival, trapped in a loop of recurring warfare that defined their existence. Environmental evidence helped explain why. Around 13,000 years ago, the world was shifting, the Ice Age was ending, and Africa's climate was swinging between wet and dry extremes. The Nile became both lifeline and battlefield. When food was scarce, small groups moved closer to the river's fertile edges, crowding into limited territory. Tension built as rival bands competed for fishing grounds and safe places to camp. The survivors of one raid might grow strong again, only to become the attackers next time. Violence had become strategy, a grim form of population control and resource defense. The bones from Jebel Sahaba captured that cycle perfectly. Every healed wound was proof of survival. Every unhealed one was proof of its end. Together they painted a picture of a people living under constant threat, adapting to war as a way of life. The scientists who studied them began to understand that organized conflict wasn't something humans invented after civilization. It was already part of us. The raids weren't random acts of cruelty. They were calculated moves in an endless game of survival. The echoes of those raids still whisper through time, reminding us that long before armies and nations, humanity had already learned the cruel rhythm of war without end. 13,000 years ago, the Nile was not the wide blue ribbon we know today. It was smaller, harsher, and unpredictable. The Ice Age was ending, and the climate was shifting in violent swings between floods and droughts. The great green wetlands that once spread across the valley were drying into patchy corridors of grass and dust. Herds of animals that once wandered freely were now forced to migrate along narrow paths where water still flowed. Those shrinking lifelines became the stage for the first known human war. For the people living on the river's edge, the Nile was everything. It gave them fish, reeds for shelter, and a place to drink in a landscape that was quickly turning to desert. Losing it meant death. Keeping it meant survival. And survival came with a cost. Archaeologists studying the layers of sediment around Jebel Sahaba found clear signs of these environmental changes. Fossil pollen trapped in the soil showed that forests had given way to dry savanna. Fish bones and shells mixed with sand revealed that the river had receded over time. The once fertile floodplain had become a narrow strip of life surrounded by wasteland. Small groups of hunter-gatherers, who had once lived far apart, now found themselves pressed shoulder to shoulder along the same stretch of water. Tension was inevitable. The Nile had become too valuable to share. The river was not just a source of water. It was a road, a food supply, and a defense line, all in one. Control of even a few kilometers could mean the difference between abundance and starvation. Archaeologists believe the people of Jebel Sahaba may have lived near a bend or crossing point where fish and animals were easy to catch. It would have been a natural magnet for neighboring groups. But when resources shrink, cooperation collapses. Those who once traded might now raid. Those who once shared water might guard it with weapons. The killings at Jebel Sahaba were the result of that pressure boiling over. Climatic data from the same period shows that the world was entering the Younger Dryas, a sudden global cold snap that brought drought across much of Africa. The Nile's flow weakened, its floods less predictable. The people living there had no way of knowing why the climate was changing. To them, the world itself must have felt like it was turning against them. Under those conditions, competition became desperate. When the archaeologists looked at the pattern of repeated raids and deaths, they realized that these early humans were not just violent, they were fighting over a collapsing ecosystem. Every wound in the bones, every flint point buried in the sand, was a symptom of scarcity. The Nile had become a prize worth dying for. The story of Jebel Sahaba was not just about hate or power. It was about survival on a planet that was changing faster than its people could adapt. The river that once gave life had become the border between living and dying, and along its shrinking banks, humanity learned that even the most sacred lifeline can become a battlefield. The people who lived and died at Jebel Sahaba were not simple-minded wanderers stumbling through prehistory. They were hunters, foragers, and above all, strategists. Every trace left in the sand shows a level of planning that would surprise anyone who still imagines early humans as primitive cave dwellers. These were people who understood the land as if it were a living map. They knew where the water would collect after a storm, which trails animals used to reach the river, and how their rivals would move when resources grew scarce. When the time came to fight, they used that knowledge like a weapon. They turned survival into strategy. The attackers who struck the Jebel Sahaba group didn't act on impulse. Archaeologists studying the site could see the precision in every detail. The placement of the victims, the direction of the projectiles, and the layout of the terrain all pointed to careful planning. The killers had chosen their moment and their ground. They must have watched from a distance, waiting for the right time, maybe when the victims were gathering water or resting by the river. They would have known that once trapped against the Nile, escape was impossible. It was not chaos, it was choreography. This level of coordination suggests roles within the attacking group. Some would have acted as scouts, tracking the rival band's movements over days or weeks. Others likely set up ambush points, hiding behind rocks or dunes, ready to block escape routes. There might have been decoys who approached first to draw attention, while the main group moved into position. Once the trap was set, the first volley of arrows would have fallen like a wave, forcing panic and confusion. Then came the close pursuit, the finishers with spears and clubs to make sure no one survived. Each role required communication, trust, and timing. These were the tactics of people who knew that success depended on unity. Even their tools reveal forethought. The flint projectiles weren't made hastily. They were prepared in advance, crafted from materials gathered miles away. Some points matched in shape and size, showing they were made as part of a coordinated effort. The attackers carried them in bundles, ready to unleash a rapid rain of weapons. That kind of preparation takes time and cooperation. It means they weren't just hunters reacting to danger. They were organized fighters who could plan days ahead. When scientists talk about Jebel Sahaba, they often describe it as the world's oldest known battlefield. But it was more than that. It was the proof that by 13,000 years ago, humans already thought like tacticians. They could plan, coordinate, and execute complex maneuvers for a common goal. The same minds that once tracked herds across the plains had learned to track each other. In their strategies, we can see the roots of something that would define every future civilization: the ability to think ahead, to cooperate in destruction as well as in creation. They were hunters, yes, but also soldiers of a kind the world had never seen before. The more scientists studied the Jebel Sahaba site, the clearer it became that the massacre was not a spontaneous clash. It was a coordinated operation that must have taken days or even weeks to plan. Every clue buried in the sand pointed to logistics, supply, and strategy. The attackers weren't just a few angry hunters acting on impulse. They were a trained group that moved with precision. Archaeologists began asking new questions. How many people were involved? How long did it take to prepare? And where did they get the materials to launch such a deadly ambush 13,000 years ago? The answers revealed a level of organization few believed possible for that time. The flint points found at the site were the first clue. When researchers traced their chemical composition, they discovered that many were made from stone not found anywhere near Jebel Sahaba. Some came from quarries dozens of kilometers away, meaning the attackers had either traveled long distances to collect them or traded with other groups. That detail alone changed everything. It meant they had a supply network, a system of sourcing and transporting materials specifically for warfare. These weren't scavenged weapons. They were part of a stockpile built in advance. Someone had organized it, overseen it, and ensured that every fighter had what they needed before the ambush began. Then came the caches. Scattered around the site were clusters of unused or broken projectile points. Archaeologists believe these were resharpening and rearming spots where attackers paused to repair their tools or replace damaged tips. That suggested the assault lasted long enough to require mid-battle maintenance. It also hinted that the attackers knew exactly where they would fight and prepared staging areas ahead of time. They may have hidden extra weapons in the dunes or rocks, ready to grab and continue firing once their first wave of arrows was spent. This level of preparation was astonishing. It meant someone had walked the terrain, planned the angles, and placed resources exactly where they would be needed. The number of projectiles found also hinted at the size of the attacking force. Based on the density of stone points and fragments, scientists estimate that at least 20 to 30 attackers took part in the strike, possibly more. That might not sound like much, but in a world of small hunter-gatherer bands, it was an army. Coordinating that many people required leadership, planning, and shared motivation. Whether it was revenge, territory, or survival, they had united for a single purpose. The most haunting part of the discovery was what it revealed about human intelligence. The people who carried out this ambush had the same brains we do. They could anticipate, organize, and communicate complex plans. They could manage logistics, stock resources, and coordinate timing with deadly precision. The massacre at Jebel Sahaba wasn't just an act of violence. It was a lesson in how far human cooperation can go when driven by fear and necessity. The attackers mastered the art of planning not for creation, but for destruction. And in doing so, they left behind the first logistical blueprint of war. Imagine the scene before the attack began. The air is still, the horizon painted in the grey of early dawn. Along the ridge above the Nile, shadowy figures crouch behind rocks, watching the camp below. They can see the faint flicker of firelight from their targets who have settled near the riverbank for the night. Somewhere, a hand lifts, signalling silence. The attackers wait for the right moment. They have no written language, no metal, no formal armies. Yet they communicate with the precision of soldiers. The evidence left behind suggests they used sight, sound, and timing as their weapons, long before drums and flags ever existed. They were masters of the dark. Scientists studying the Jebel Sahaba massacre realized that the success of the ambush depended on coordination. The attack had to begin at the same time from multiple angles to trap the victims. That meant the attackers must have used some form of signaling. The terrain offered clues. The ridge that overlooked the river gave a perfect view of the valley below. From there, torchlight could have been used to signal readiness, or maybe the gleam of reflected sunlight off a piece of polished stone at dawn. Even small changes in firelight or shadow would have been visible across the open landscape. In a world without spoken commands that could give away their position, these early fighters relied on nature's own language of light. Sound might have played a role too. The desert air carries noise for miles, and a single sharp call, a stone knocked against another, or a low hum could have served as cues. In some parts of Africa, hunter-gatherer groups still use rhythmic tapping or subtle whistles to coordinate movements during hunts. It is possible that similar sounds echoed over the Nile 13,000 years ago. A single signal would unleash chaos below as dozens of arrows darkened the sky. The first volley would strike before the victims even understood what was happening. The timing of the attack also mattered. Archaeologists believe the ambush may have occurred in early morning when the sun was low and shadows stretched across the riverbank. From that angle, the attackers on the ridge would have been nearly invisible, hidden in the glare of the rising sun. The victims, their eyes still adjusting to the light, would have seen only dark silhouettes before the first projectiles hit. Every element of the environment was used as a tactical advantage. Light, sound, and timing combined into a deadly code. The massacre at Jebel Sahaba was not just about brute strength, it was about intelligence. The attackers understood the psychology of surprise. They knew when their prey was most vulnerable, and they coordinated their actions with precision that speaks to deep communication skills. 13,000 years before recorded history, humans were already using signals, fire, and shadow to wage organized war. They had learned how to turn the natural world into a battlefield of silence, light, and fear. When the archaeologists finished uncovering the battlefield at Jebel Sahaba, one mystery remained. Where were the tools, the ornaments, the belongings of the dead? Normally, when early humans buried their dead, they left behind beads, stone knives, and personal items. But here, the ground was almost empty. The victims had been stripped of nearly everything. It was not just an act of killing, it was an act of taking. This was one of the earliest signs of organized plunder, proof that the violence wasn't only about hatred or territory, it was about resources, survival, and perhaps something even deeper, the first flicker of greed. Archaeologists catalogued every item they found, and the pattern was clear. The bodies had been looted after the massacre. Many of the skeletons had small perforations around their necks, signs that they had once worn necklaces made of shell or bone. But none of those ornaments remained. Only a few broken beads were found scattered in the sand. The tools that hunter-gatherers normally carried, like scrapers, blades, or fishing hooks, were missing too. The attackers had taken them all. To them, each object had value, a weapon, a tool, or even a symbol of status. The site wasn't just a killing ground, it was a place where the victors cleaned the field of everything useful. The absence of these items told its own story. After the attack, the survivors must have fled or been captured, leaving the dead behind. The attackers would have returned to search the bodies, pulling off ornaments and taking their victims' possessions. Archaeologists even found marks in the soil where fire had been built after the fighting. Perhaps the attackers cooked, celebrated, or burned what they couldn't carry. The plundered artifacts showed that these early humans already understood the rewards of victory. They didn't just fight for life, they fought for gain. Among the few items that remained, scientists found fragments of fishing tools and decorative shells that came from the Red Sea, hundreds of kilometers away. That meant the Jebel Sahaba group had been part of a trade network, exchanging goods across long distances. Those shells weren't just jewelry, they were status symbols. Whoever wore them was showing wealth and connection. The attackers must have recognized their value and taken them as trophies. That moment may have marked one of the first times in history that human death was tied to wealth. The victims didn't just lose their lives, they lost everything that made them who they were. When the archaeologists looked across the empty site, the silence was heavy. Every missing tool, every stolen ornament, spoke of an aftermath that was as human as the violence itself. The victors walked away richer. The victims were forgotten until the wind uncovered them thousands of years later. What happened at Jebel Sahaba was not just survival against scarcity. It was the beginning of something more complex, the realization that power could be measured not only in strength, but in what you could take from others. For most of history, people believed that war began with civilization. The story went that once humans settled into villages, built farms, and formed hierarchies, they started fighting over land, power, and wealth. But the bones of Jebel Sahaba tell a very different story. They show that organized warfare existed thousands of years before the first crops were planted, before pottery was shaped, before kings or cities or written laws. 13,000 years ago, humans who lived entirely by hunting and gathering were already capable of planning, ambush, and mass killing. It wasn't civilization that created war, it was humanity itself. The people at Jebel Sahaba were not farmers. They had no permanent houses or fields. They followed the rhythms of the Nile, moving with the seasons to fish, hunt, and forage. Yet their behavior on that riverbank reveals the same elements of warfare seen in later empires. They had strategies, logistics, and coordinated attacks. The victims were buried in patterns that proved the assault wasn't random. The killers had used terrain, timing, and surprise, just as any army might. This discovery overturned the comforting myth that violence came later, that humanity became dangerous only after it built walls and thrones. The truth is that long before the first plough touched soil, people were already fighting for dominance. What makes this revelation even more striking is that these early humans had none of the structures we associate with war. There were no governments to order an attack, no generals to issue commands, no temples promising reward or vengeance. Everything they did came from shared purpose and necessity. They organized themselves through kinship and instinct. Their wars were fought not by soldiers, but by families, groups of hunters who banded together for survival. That meant planning came not from authority, but from cooperation. The same unity that let them hunt mammoth or buffalo could be turned toward ambushing rivals. They didn't need civilization to coordinate. Their minds were enough. Archaeologists have found similar signs of violence from the same period across Africa and Europe, but none as clear as at Jebel Sahaba. The evidence there forms a bridge between survival conflict and full-scale warfare. It shows that the roots of organized violence run deep into human evolution. Planning, teamwork, and strategy weren't inventions of civilization. They were traits that evolved long before civilization existed. The same intelligence that helped humans build communities also gave them the ability to destroy them. When scientists finally accepted that the Jebel Sahaba massacre was real warfare, it forced a difficult question. If humans could plan mass killings before they ever learned to farm, what does that say about us? Maybe civilization didn't invent war. Maybe it only gave us better tools to fight it. The people of Jebel Sahaba proved that planning, cooperation, and violence have always walked together. They were not primitive savages. They were the first tacticians, the first soldiers, and the first proof that you don't need civilization to make war. You only need humans. Jebel Sahaba may be the most famous prehistoric battlefield, but it was not alone. Across the world, scattered traces of similar violence have been uncovered, each one telling the same story. Wherever food and water became scarce, humans turned their intelligence toward war. Long before cities, fortresses, or written history, the ground itself recorded the pattern. The names of the places vary, but the rhythm is always the same. Scarcity leads to strategy. Strategy leads to killing. In Kenya's Rift Valley, near a dry lake bed called Nataruk, archaeologists found another chilling scene frozen in time. There, 10,000 years ago, a group of hunter-gatherers were ambushed beside the water. Their bones still lay as they fell, some with obsidian blades embedded in them. One man had his hands tied. A pregnant woman was found with her arms crossed over her belly, still wearing a shell bracelet. The attackers had struck without warning, just as at Jebel Sahaba. The similarities were unmistakable. Open terrain, trapped victims, projectile wounds, and signs of restraint. Nataruk showed that even separated by thousands of years and miles, the logic of violence remained the same. Further north, in Europe, skeletons from a site in Germany called Talheim tell another version of the story. Around 7,000 years ago, a farming community was wiped out in a single raid. The bodies were dumped in a mass grave. Men, women, and children, all mixed together. The skulls bore crushing blows from stone axes. It was a later chapter in the same human pattern. Once again, competition over land and food had turned neighbors into enemies. The difference was that by then, people had begun to settle and farm. The violence that had begun with small foraging bands was now spreading into the first villages. Civilization had changed the tools, not the instinct. In Spain, the site of El Mirón Cave revealed bones from around 12,000 years ago, with deep cuts and fractures that matched weapons. In Sudan, near the Nile, but farther south than Jebel Sahaba, other cemeteries showed evidence of repeated raids. The same story played out again and again in different environments, from arid river valleys to icy plains. When the climate shifted and resources tightened, violence followed. The scale might have been small, but the planning was always there. Ambushes, surprise attacks, and the taking of captives show that humans had mastered organized conflict long before history began recording it. These sites, scattered across continents, form a single timeline of human behavior. The pattern is universal. Groups cooperate when resources are stable, but when drought, flood, or famine strike, that cooperation fractures. Intelligence becomes weaponized. The hunters become soldiers, and survival becomes conquest. Jebel Sahaba stands at the beginning of that story, but it is echoed in every other killing field that came after. From Africa to Europe, from the end of the Ice Age to the dawn of farming, one truth stays the same. Wherever survival is limited, organization breeds violence. It always has. When the people of Jebel Sahaba went to war, they weren't just fighting over food or water. They were fighting for identity, for belonging, for the invisible line that separated us from them. Deep in the human mind lies an ancient switch that turns cooperation inward and hostility outward. It is what psychologists now call coalitional aggression, and its roots stretch back to the very first groups who learned that unity could mean survival. 13,000 years ago, that instinct was already in full force. The bones of Jebel Sahaba show what happens when trust becomes a weapon and fear becomes a boundary. Every hunter-gatherer band depended on cooperation. They shared food, cared for the sick, and taught their children together. But that same cooperation created fragile borders. Outsiders were dangerous because they competed for the same resources. To protect the group, early humans developed a powerful sense of we. It bonded them through loyalty, but it also created suspicion of anyone who didn't belong. When times were good, those borders were soft. When drought hit or herds disappeared, they hardened into walls. The psychology of belonging turned into the psychology of war. Archaeologists studying Jebel Sahaba could see the results of that transformation. The massacre wasn't random violence. It was a calculated strike by one group against another, a message written in blood. The attackers probably saw themselves as defending their people, their children, their hunting grounds. To them, the victims were not humans in the same sense they were. They were outsiders, rivals, threats. This mindset is still familiar today. It's the same mental wiring that makes soldiers fight fiercely for their unit or fans cheer for their team. But in the world of Jebel Sahaba, that instinct was stripped of rules or mercy. There were no treaties or peace talks, only the raw instinct to protect one's own by destroying others. Scientists studying modern tribal conflicts have found that small groups under stress often use violence to reinforce unity. Shared enemies strengthen internal bonds. The same would have been true for these early humans. Attacking outsiders wasn't just about eliminating competition. It was about proving loyalty, earning reputation, and signaling strength. Young hunters who joined the raid would have gained status. Families would have seen their warriors as protectors. In that way, fear and identity became tools for survival. Violence was rewarded because it kept the group strong in a world of scarcity. The tragedy is that this instinct never faded. The same brain that helped small bands cooperate also ensured that humans would always draw lines between us and them. Jebel Sahaba is a mirror held up to that ancient psychology. It shows how easily trust can become exclusion, how quickly defense turns into attack. These early humans weren't monsters. They were acting on instincts we all still carry, instincts that once kept us alive but now fuel conflicts on far larger scales. 13,000 years later, we're still living with the echo of that first division, the one that made us human, and the one that taught us to fear each other. War has always been a destroyer, but at Jebel Sahaba, it was also a creator. The same conflict that left dozens dead on the banks of the Nile 13,000 years ago also pushed human innovation forward. Every weapon found at the site tells the story of invention born from desperation. Sharper points, stronger adhesives, and more efficient hafting techniques were all refined, not just for hunting animals, but for fighting other humans. Warfare became the unintentional mother of invention, forcing people to improve or die. The battlefield became a workshop of survival. Archaeologists studying the projectiles from Jebel Sahaba noticed something fascinating. The flint tips were not crude or hastily made. They were expertly crafted, each shaped for speed, balance, and penetration. Some had fine serrations along their edges, designed to cut deeper into flesh and cause more bleeding. Others were small and triangular, optimized to fly farther and strike faster. Many were made from stone that had been transported from faraway sources, showing that their makers planned their weapon stockpiles well in advance. This was not the work of beginners. These were people who had mastered their craft and were constantly improving it through the pressure of conflict. The weapons also revealed advances in hafting, the way stone tips were attached to wooden shafts. Microscopic traces of plant resin and animal sinew showed that the people of Jebel Sahaba used complex adhesives to secure their tools. Some even mixed materials together, creating compounds that could withstand heat and shock. Every improvement meant a higher chance of survival. Those who made better weapons lived longer, passed on their skills, and spread their knowledge. In this way, war became an invisible teacher, shaping technology generation after generation. Even hunting tactics changed. Archaeologists believe that many of the same skills used in battle were first practiced in the hunt. Coordinated movements, ambush strategies, and timing attacks all came from pursuing prey. But once groups began fighting each other, those techniques evolved faster. Early humans learned to think ahead, to plan terrain advantage, to anticipate movement. They became better strategists, not just in war, but in every part of life. The skills that once helped them track gazelles now help them track rival tribes. Conflict honed their intelligence like a blade. It's a pattern that never stopped. Every leap in human technology, from stone weapons to metallurgy to engines, began with the same spark: the need to outthink and outfight an opponent. The tragedy of Jebel Sahaba is that it shows this began long before civilization. The massacre that unfolded there wasn't just a story of death. It was a story of progress bought with blood. The survivors walked away with better tools, sharper minds, and new ideas for defense. The same creativity that made humans artists and builders also made them warriors. 13,000 years ago, on the banks of a dying river, war became the first great accelerator of human invention. For a long time, people liked to imagine that our ancient ancestors lived in a peaceful paradise before civilization ruined everything. The idea of the noble savage, pure, and free from greed or violence became a comforting myth. Others went the opposite way, claiming that early humans were locked in endless warfare, that life before cities was nothing but blood and fear. But the bones of Jebel Sahaba tell a more complicated story. The truth is that humanity has always lived somewhere between peace and chaos. Our ancestors were neither saints nor monsters. They were people who fought when they had to, who planned violence when survival demanded it, and who could also live for generations in peace. The massacre at Jebel Sahaba was not constant warfare. It was a moment of crisis. Archaeologists studying the site found signs that the community had thrived for years before the attack. They hunted, fished, raised families, and traded along the river. Life was not always violent. But when the climate shifted and resources shrank, peace collapsed. Scarcity turned neighbors into enemies. In that sense, their world was not so different from ours. Violence came in waves, tied to environment and opportunity. It was situational, not permanent. They fought when balance broke, when one group's survival meant another's destruction. This idea changes everything about how we see the prehistoric world. It shows that early humans were capable of long stretches of cooperation and even trade. They built relationships, exchanged tools and ornaments, and shared knowledge. But they were also capable of sudden, devastating violence when threatened. It wasn't mindless aggression. It was strategy born from necessity. When researchers mapped the wounds at Jebel Sahaba, they saw intelligence in every strike. That kind of precision doesn't come from chaos. It comes from calculation. The attackers knew what they were doing and why. They weren't savage killers. They were people making hard choices in a collapsing environment. Understanding that balance helps break the myth of the permanent warrior too. There is no evidence that early humans lived in non-stop combat. Their lives were mostly focused on survival, family, and community. But when resources dwindled, their ability to organize for violence made them powerful and dangerous. That duality is what makes us human. We are cooperative by nature, but that cooperation can easily turn defensive, then hostile, when our survival feels threatened. The story of Jebel Sahaba isn't about proving that early humans were peaceful or violent. It's about showing how flexible they were. They could build alliances one season and ambush those same allies the next if conditions changed. They could create art, raise children, and still plan war. The truth of our past is complex and uncomfortable. Peace and violence were not opposites. They were part of the same survival system. The people who lived 13,000 years ago understood something we still struggle with today. Humanity's strength lies in its ability to cooperate, but also in its terrifying talent for turning cooperation into conflict when pushed too far. When archaeologists study a site like Jebel Sahaba, they are reading a story written in silence. There are no words, no carvings, no survivors to tell what happened. All that remains are bones and tools buried in sand for 13,000 years. Each crack, each cut, each fragment is a clue, but clues can be misleading. The scientists who study ancient violence have to walk a thin line between discovery and imagination. They must listen to what the bones say without forcing them to speak louder than they can. The truth of Jebel Sahaba comes from that balance, from the humility of knowing that even the most careful reconstruction can only glimpse the past through a narrow window. Forensic anthropologists began by asking the simplest questions. Who were these people? How did they die? The bones provided the first answers. Sharp, edged punctures matched the shapes of stone points. Healed wounds proved that violence had happened before. The patterns of fractures revealed that many victims were hit from the same direction, suggesting a planned ambush. Those facts are solid, measurable, and repeatable. But beyond that, interpretation becomes more delicate. Scientists cannot know the exact motives of the killers. They can infer stress from climate data, competition for food, and the strategic positioning of the bodies, but they cannot see hatred or fear in the fossils. Those emotions vanished long ago, leaving only their physical consequences. To avoid overreach, researchers use every available tool. They compare data from other sites, run computer models, and even replicate ancient weapons to test how injuries were made. This careful process separates evidence from assumption. A cut in bone can tell you where an arrow struck, but not what the shooter was thinking. Still, some patterns are too precise to ignore. The trajectories of the projectiles, the clustering of the bodies, and the absence of random scatter all point to intent. Planning leaves its own fingerprint, and at Jebel Sahaba, that fingerprint is unmistakable. These people were not caught in a natural disaster. They were caught in a human one. What makes this site so haunting is how much it refuses to explain. There are no monuments or trophies, no signs of who won or lost, just bones, lying in their final positions, silent but undeniable. Scientists must accept that silence. The story they tell is never complete, but that humility is what makes it powerful. Each new study refines the picture without claiming final truth. The dead speak only through patterns, and those patterns must be read with care. In the end, the real achievement of modern archaeology is not that it solves every mystery, but that it learns to respect what cannot be known. The people of Jebel Sahaba left behind no words, yet their bones told the first chapter of human warfare. The scientists who uncovered them did not exaggerate or romanticize. They simply followed the evidence, letting the past reveal itself piece by piece. 13,000 years later, that quiet honesty lets us hear what the dead could not say. When scientists uncovered the bones at Jebel Sahaba, they were not just finding evidence of an ancient tragedy, they were finding a mirror. The same forces that drove people to kill 13,000 years ago are still shaping the world today. The faces and weapons have changed, but the logic has not. When resources shrink, when groups feel threatened, when information twists into fear, humanity falls back into the same ancient patterns. The massacre by the Nile is not just a story about the past. It is a warning about the present. The people of Jebel Sahaba fought over water, the most basic resource of all. Today, nations still fight over the same thing. As the planet warms and rivers dry, conflicts over water and land are becoming more common. What happened in that narrow stretch of desert so long ago is happening again, only on a larger scale. Scarcity still turns neighbors into rivals. Choke points still decide who eats and who starves. The only difference now is that the battles play out with satellites and drones instead of flint and bone. The strategy, however, remains identical. Control the resource. Control survival. Another echo of the ancient past lies in how fear spreads. The people who attacked Jebel Sahaba likely acted on rumor or assumption, believing their rivals were a threat. Modern humans do the same thing, only faster. Misinformation travels at the speed of light through screens and networks, shaping opinions and igniting anger long before facts can catch up. 13,000 years ago, suspicion might have passed through whispered words. Now it travels through digital echo chambers. In both worlds, perception is more dangerous than truth. Fear becomes justification, and once fear takes root, violence feels inevitable. Even the idea of preemptive strike, the decision to attack before being attacked, was already present in the Jebel Sahaba ambush. The killers struck first to eliminate a perceived danger. That same mindset drives much of human conflict today. Whether between nations or individuals, the logic of striking first still feels like safety, even when it leads to ruin. The ancient battlefield on the Nile shows how deep this instinct runs. It is not new. It is part of what made us survive, but also part of what keeps us trapped in cycles of destruction. What makes Jebel Sahaba matter now is not just the horror of what happened, but the clarity it gives us. It strips away illusions about human nature. We like to think we are more civilized, but the roots of our violence are older than civilization itself. They are buried in our DNA, in the same minds that once planned an ambush by the river. Understanding that truth doesn't excuse what we do, it warns us. The people of Jebel Sahaba lived on a changing planet, fighting over dwindling resources. So do we. Their story ends in extinction. Ours doesn't have to. The bones at Jebel Sahaba are more than relics. They are a message from the beginning of human history, carved in silence and buried beneath the sand. 13,000 years ago, a group of people stood on the edge of a shrinking river and fought for their lives. They planned, they coordinated, they ambushed, and they killed. It was not madness or savagery. It was intelligence turned inward. The same intelligence that would one day build pyramids, cities, and machines. The battlefield by the Nile is a reminder that the gift that made us thrive is the same one that made us dangerous. Planning was our greatest weapon and our greatest risk. Archaeologists who uncovered the site often speak of it with awe and unease. Every fracture, every embedded arrowhead tells the story of minds that could imagine the future. The attackers did not act out of blind rage. They calculated, they chose the terrain, waited for the right moment, and used weapons crafted with care. Their success depended on foresight, communication, and cooperation, the very traits that define humanity. But in their success lay the seed of our paradox. The same skills that let us work together to build shelter and find food also let us organize destruction on a scale no other species could match. Jebel Sahaba is where that realization begins. Standing there today, among the eroded cliffs and ancient riverbeds, you can almost feel the weight of it. The bones are quiet, but they speak with a kind of authority that no text or monument ever could. They remind us that violence is not an invention of civilization. It is as old as thought itself. Yet so is compassion, strategy, and the will to endure. Those people fought because they believed survival was worth any cost, and in a way, they succeeded. Their descendants carried those same instincts through time, shaping the world that came after. We are them, refined but not changed. That is why the battlefield matters. It is not a story of monsters or victims. It is a story of us. Every war, every rivalry, every act of courage or cruelty follows the same pattern drawn in the dust of that ancient floodplain. Planning is power. Power creates survival. And survival always comes with a choice. We can use it to build or to destroy. The bones in the sand do not condemn us for what we are. They simply show us the cost of forgetting. 13,000 years later, we are still standing at the river's edge, facing our own changing world. The same intelligence that turned flint into a weapon now builds machines that could end all life or save it. The warning written in bone is simple. To understand what makes us dangerous is to understand what makes us human. If planning is the key to survival, then wisdom must be its price.